This is next level. Russia's drones have battered Ukraine for 3 brutal years, millions of them. Kamikaze attacks, swarm raids, a constant airborne threat. But now the UK just unveiled something insane, a weapon built specifically to hunt drones like these out of the sky. Its name, Gravehawk. This isn't some high-budget gimmick or flashy prototype, it's a real system, a game changer, and it's already on the battlefield. Backed by Denmark and custom-built for Ukraine's needs, Gravehawk flips the script on air defense, repurposing Cold War missile tech into a cost-effective drone killer designed for modern war. And that's a huge deal, because while Ukraine has been producing drones by the millions to stay in the fight, it's been burning through expensive NATO missiles just to keep Russian Shaheds from taking out power grids, tanks, and frontline positions. Now, that changes. So what exactly is the Gravehawk system? How does it work, and why did the UK wait until 2025 to roll it out? And could this be the beginning of a whole new way NATO fights wars? Let's break it down. Let's start with the actual news about the defense system and how it was possibly developed by the British. The Gravehawk anti-air system was first noted in announcements made in mid-January by British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. The addition of the Gravehawks into the Ukrainian lineup was a part of the UK's pledge to provide over $5.7 billion in both direct economic and military assistance and in supplies for the country's existing defense systems. However, the British remained relatively tight-lipped about the Gravehawk itself, leading many to speculate on what exactly the system achieved. Additional details followed, clarifying that Gravehawks were actually little more than modified missile launchers that could use a few different types of anti-air missiles more effectively than existing systems in Ukraine. But the way that the Gravehawk utilizes the missiles is by itself innovative enough to make the system be considered a practically new take on modern warfare. You see, while traditional ground-based anti-air defense systems have actually done pretty well at repelling aerial threats that Russia has put out so far, the war in Ukraine represented a significant strategic and ideological shift in how modern warfare is actually being fought. Prior to the war, ground-based systems were designed to remove substantial missiles, such as cruise and ballistic missiles, capable of flying over entire continents. Alternatively, the systems were designed to intercept or destroy enemy aircraft, with the help of large-scale early warning detection systems that relied on scanning the sky for rapidly moving large targets. But the war in Ukraine didn't see Russia rely exclusively on its fleet of cruise missiles as many initially expected. Instead, Russia bought up the Iranian supply of Shahed 136 kamikaze drones. These drones were designed to fly long distances and easily detonate their explosive payload on contact, shedding any attempts to survive the process. One of the major benefits of using these kinds of drones is their relative simplicity, which directly leads to their cost-effectiveness. A Shahed drone is estimated to cost Iran roughly $20,000 to $60,000 to manufacture, at which point the country's weapons exporters sell it for under $200,000 abroad, mainly to Russia and its immediate allies. Reports from early 2024 suggested that Russia even has the capability to manufacture the same drone itself, which can bring the overall cost closer to the one of the domestic model. At that point, Russia's ability to purchase other drones could multiply. So far, Russia leveraged the Shahed 136 extensively, capitalizing on its low cost to launch sustained, massive attacks, targeting civilian infrastructure, energy grids, and military facilities. The Shahed drones effectively function not only as weapons, but also as a probing mechanism, allowing Russian forces to systematically test, identify, and map Ukraine's air defense capabilities and response patterns. By repeatedly launching waves of these low-cost drones, Russia likely gained tactical intelligence on Ukraine's defensive deployments and attempted to degrade the country's overall defense readiness over time. This created a cost-effective method of warfare that highlighted the strategic impact of inexpensive yet highly deployable drone technology. These swarm attacks forced Ukraine to expend costly surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft resources, revealing vulnerabilities and gaps in Ukraine's, and by extension, NATO's defensive strategy. A typical ground-based defense system that could compete with the Shahed's speed is the Patriot, but the price of a single Patriot PAC-3 missile ranges between $2 and $4 million. As such, the Patriot was never technically designed to deal with Shahed drones, but with more substantial threats like aircraft. Early on in the war, when Patriots and other similar anti-air defensive systems were delivered to Ukraine, Russia all but abandoned the prospect of using its fleet of aircraft, which was estimated to be roughly 10 times that of Ukraine's own air forces. Instead of leveraging its potential air superiority, Russia continued to batter Ukraine with missiles and drones. The aircraft were only used to deploy glide bombs, putting them outside of conventional anti-air defense range, while the glide bombs themselves are more difficult to intercept. This brings us to the first reason why the Gravehawks could be the solution to the problem with the aforementioned air-to-air missiles. A typical air-to-air missile is a more cost-effective solution in aerial warfare. However, they are famously only deployed by aircraft, most commonly fighter jets. A single fighter jet would typically store several air-to-air missiles, often of different types, and use its onboard computer to launch the missile at an aerial target, typically another aircraft. But Ukraine hasn't received many air-to-air missiles, or if it did, it couldn't really use them. The reason for that is twofold. First, until the latter half of 2024, Ukraine's air forces were predominantly made of Soviet-era MiG-29s and Su-27s. While Ukraine managed to obtain more of these airplanes from other NATO countries, most of whom bought the planes second-hand from former Soviet or Warsaw Pact members, that still left its air force largely incompatible with the missiles that originated from the West. Even if Ukraine did get a substantial number of air-to-air missiles, its aircraft would need to be retrofitted with deployment and guidance systems for NATO missiles, which would take them out of commission for possibly months at a time. Secondly, when the first NATO-donated Western aircraft like F-16 started flying over Ukraine, Russia had already committed to using drones and already had a significant numerical advantage. Russia could leverage its large logistics networks to ship its own anti-air systems closer to the front. The drone attacks came in such numbers and frequencies that Ukraine would have to fly its newly obtained aircraft at a breakneck pace to keep up. With most air-to-air missiles having lower ranges than their surface-to-air equivalents, Russia could effectively threaten Ukraine's air force by using Shahed drones and even drones without any explosive payload as bait. So even when France bolstered the Ukrainian air force further with Mirage 2000 fighter jets, aircraft remained Ukraine's early warning and secondary defensive systems due to the fear of losing such valuable assets to attacks that were compounding daily. These two factors resulted in Ukraine relying on two different avenues of anti-air defenses. Russia's smaller drones, which were converted from commercial quadcopters and similar devices, were countered by Ukraine's own army of drones and short-range, radar-based defenses. The promising results produced by the latter encouraged the military to use varied tactics to neutralize these targets. On the other hand, large missiles like cruise missiles or ballistic missiles or their equivalent, which Russia used occasionally, were countered by NATO-donated long-range anti-air systems, such as the aforementioned Patriot. This left Shaheds as Russia's middle ground option, for which Ukraine was forced to use a combination of electronic, early warning, and conventional anti-air defenses to combat. And the Gravehawks have the potential to combine all of those in a single package. The key here lies in how Gravehawks are compartmentalized land-based missile launchers that utilize air-to-air missiles. For one, the Gravehawk itself isn't a vehicle, but a solution made from three distinct parts that can work as a whole or potentially be adapted from Ukraine's existing stock. The key component is the launcher itself, which uses a custom-made platform that integrates refurbished jet launchers from Su-27s and MiG-29s to deploy air-to-air missiles. The two supportive pieces are the command and control console for precision targeting and an 8x8 military truck for transport. The launcher fits into the average shipping container, which is then mounted onto the truck, showcasing the potential for mass producing and transporting the systems from the UK to Ukraine. But how do air-to-air missiles compare against their land-deployed counterparts? For one, using them negates some of the benefits of fighter jets as missile deployment systems. For example, jets will always have a larger operational range and freedom of movement, as well as superior maneuverability to dodge enemy attacks and reposition for optimal attack angles. However, since Ukraine can't really use its aircraft in this manner anyway, the net loss of mobility can be completely disregarded. However, the Gravehawks still have advantages. Air-to-air missiles are typically more favorable solutions when dealing with airborne threats, so the system can leverage these extremely precise and tailor-made solutions in novel ways. This gives it much more of an advantage when dealing with mobile yet small targets like Shaheds. This benefits the overall operational costs. The air-to-air missiles that the Gravehawk uses are already in Ukrainian stocks. This means that the system is actually a distinct solution compared to the more advanced Patriot system and its alternatives. Therefore, NATO can afford to send other types of missiles for these systems without Ukraine using the more expensive interceptors on relatively cheap and plentiful targets. Alternatively, NATO can attempt to broker with other countries that have stocks of missiles that Gravehawks can use to ship them to Ukraine, replenishing the supply without dipping into the members' own stocks, much like it did with the Soviet-era weaponry and ammo. This basically separates the solutions for drones and cruise or ballistic missiles, which ultimately allows Ukraine to tailor its defenses when needed. Similarly, since the actual system itself is basically a modified missile launcher taken from a jet, being retrofitted in a container makes it relatively easy to be slotted onto different armored vehicles or trucks for transport. The 8x8 truck that was showcased is likely just one of the transport options, as it doesn't seem to bring much to the system apart from a suitable flat surface to affix the container to. Using a land-based platform in this way also potentially reduces the operating cost of firing a missile. The Gravehawk system is designed to be operated by a crew of 5, likely including the transport driver and command and control personnel. Secondly, it precludes the need for fuel-hungry jets to create an effective anti-air defense system, which are expensive to field, difficult to move around without the enemy following their movements, and require dedicated airstrips to be deployed. The final fact is perhaps the most important, as it allows the Gravehawks to become an entirely new way of utilizing ammunition that Ukraine already has at its disposal. But in truth, the Gravehawks aren't an entirely new invention either, at least on the surface. Reports going as far back as August 2023 suggest that ground launchers were being tested for their possible use as air-to-air missile launchers instead of traditional surface-to-air missiles. The reports didn't have any specifics other than the photos of a supposed Frankensam that had British air-to-air missiles loaded and used a modified Supercat chassis as the base of the vehicle. The report from over a year and a half ago would imply that this type of weapon has been in active development one way or another for a significantly longer time, and that its debut was basically a working prototype that was used in Ukraine for field testing. This is not a particularly new concept, as many other weapons and military systems have been sent to Ukraine over the past 3 years for similar testing. However, the Gravehawk turned out to be a completely distinct system, only drawing on the concept of using air-to-air missiles, but utilizing a different type of armament for improved operational versatility. One of the main reasons behind using Ukraine as a testing bed for modern weapons is the unprecedented nature of the war. The previous biggest conflict that NATO took part in was the War on Terror in the early 2000s. There, the US and its allies maintained a practical stranglehold on the Middle East through its air and naval superiority. It was only the remoteness and harsh terrain that slowed operations, reduced the capability of the Allied forces, and ultimately slowed the conflict to a crawl that lasted for roughly 20 years in total. In Ukraine, the situation is somewhat reversed. Ukraine started on the back foot both numerically and technologically, since Russia was considered to have one of the most modern and best-equipped armies in the world. Of course, the world would later realize that much of that was based on obsoleting technology and a stubborn refusal to adapt the actual strategies of warfare to modern demands. But Russia still maintained roughly the same technological level. This was showcased in both sides using both long-range and short-range drones, particularly modified commercial drones for a bulk of their offensive and surveillance operations. While Ukraine arguably held the advantage for sheer innovation, Russia quickly caught up with its higher production capacity and quantity. Therefore, the war in Ukraine is one of the few modern conflicts where neither side could exercise a clear superiority in any given aspect of modern warfare. This gives NATO the opportunity to test its newest weapons and investigate just what makes them useful or useless in the grand scheme of contemporary combat. As such, it's likely that the Gravehawks have already proven themselves to be useful against the weapons they were designed for, namely the medium to long-range drones like the Shaheds. Any reports we get at this point are likely to have a degree of confidence in their effectiveness that shows them being veritable assets to Ukraine and by extension the UK and the rest of Europe in creating a security screen against Russia. But what missiles did the Gravehawks land on as the weapon of choice? The answer is the AA-11 or R-73 air-to-air missile, one which NATO doesn't actually produce or field natively. The R-73 is a short-range, infrared-guided air-to-air missile developed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Designed primarily for close-range dogfighting, the R-73 significantly enhanced the combat capabilities of Soviet and later Russian fighter aircraft by offering superior maneuverability and targeting precision. Its advanced aerodynamic layout coupled with thrust vectoring control allows it to perform sharp turns and engage agile targets effectively, even at extreme off-boresight angles. One of the missile's most notable benefits is its sophisticated and semi-passive infrared seeker head, which permits effective lock-on before and after launch. In fighter jets, this allowed pilots to aim the missile simply by looking at the target through an integrated helmet display, drastically reducing reaction time and enhancing situational awareness. In Gravehawks, a similar functionality is achieved by mounting a wide-angle camera onto the container that houses the launcher, which is controlled by the command module. The console electronically locks onto the target for the initial launch. After that, the missile uses its infrared seeker to follow its path and practically ensure a hit. Additionally, the R-73 missile boasts robust resistance to countermeasures such as flares and infrared jamming systems, significantly increasing its likelihood of successfully striking intended targets. Its high-speed propulsion system allows it to rapidly close in on targets with a maximum speed of Mach 2.5, minimizing the enemy's opportunity to evade or deploy effective defenses. The combination of speed, maneuverability, and advanced guidance technology makes the R-73 missile a potent asset in contemporary aerial combat. Most importantly, while NATO doesn't produce the missiles, Ukraine already has them in a relatively large supply thanks to its holdover from being in the Soviet Union, as it inherited a significant chunk of the Union's stocks of ammunition and equipment. And the Gravehawks are just one of the ways the UK has started to become one of the foremost benefactors to Ukraine in its time of need. This positive relationship and support for Ukraine has only improved over recent months, particularly from the start of the year, which coincides with the US-Ukraine relationship becoming increasingly volatile. When Donald Trump became president for the second time, his administration's ambivalent stance toward NATO and occasionally contradictory messages on Russia created uncertainty across Europe. Recognizing the potential risks of weakened transatlantic unity, the UK and France, and to a lesser extent Germany and Italy, stepped decisively into a more proactive leadership role, becoming some of the strongest and most consistent supporters of Ukraine. At a time when Ukraine desperately needed reliable international backing to counter ongoing Russian aggression, Britain's clear messaging, tangible military and intelligence assistance, as well as diplomatic advocacy, became especially vital. On the military front, the UK's contributions quickly became instrumental in boosting Ukraine's defense capabilities. One of the most impactful moves was Britain's provision of advanced anti-tank systems, particularly the next-generation light anti-tank weapons, or NLAW. These portable, easy-to-operate systems enabled Ukrainian forces to effectively counter Russian armored advances, significantly leveling the battlefield despite Ukraine's numerical and material disadvantages. Additionally, the UK launched extensive military training programs, chief among them being Operation Interflex. Often hosted on British soil, these programs were designed specifically to enhance the combat effectiveness of Ukrainian personnel. It was estimated over 51,000 Ukrainian soldiers benefited from this training, gaining proficiency in advanced combat tactics, battlefield medicine, and defensive strategies, which would prove essential during large-scale Russian offensives. Finally, the UK developed and deployed more advanced systems, including the AIM-132 ASRAAM and the Gravehawk platform. This sustained military aid reflected a strategic shift in Britain's own geopolitical posture. The UK understands that Ukraine practically serves as a shield between Russia and the rest of Europe, particularly the NATO countries bordering it. As such, not giving Ukraine security reassurances means that Russia would be free to potentially attack deeper into Europe if given the chance. This has caused some of the more recent parliament sessions to uniformly agree that the UK needs to go beyond symbolic support and develop a robust, proactive approach aimed at significantly strengthening Ukraine's resilience and combat readiness. The UK's firm stance sent clear signals to allies and adversaries alike. At a moment when Trump's presidency had created an ambiguous transatlantic landscape, with his administration at times openly questioning NATO commitments, Britain reaffirmed unwavering support for collective European security and NATO cohesion. British leaders emphasized the importance of solidarity against Russian aggression, actively rallying European allies to maintain pressure through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and support for Ukraine's sovereignty. The UK took concrete diplomatic measures, including hosting international summits and forums dedicated explicitly to reinforcing support for Ukraine. This led to the formation of the Coalition of the Willing, a group of NATO members that would increase their economic and military support, or even pledge peacekeeping forces on Ukrainian soil should the conflict reach a stage of suing for a ceasefire and peace. This is in contrast to the deal proposed by the US, which doesn't grant nearly as much security reassurance to Ukraine and tries to extract as much value from it instead. This assertive role and geopolitical pressure helped reassure not only Ukraine, but also other European nations concerned about the possibility of weakened US engagement in continental security affairs. The UK's visible leadership during this critical period inspired increased support from other NATO members, strengthening overall alliance cohesion. Britain effectively bridged gaps left by the perceived hesitancy in US leadership, reinforcing the collective Western stance against Russia and preventing potential fractures within the alliance. And now it's up to Ukraine to make the most out of the newly developed and improved anti-air weapons, especially given that Russia is ramping up its Shahed and glide bomb production and deployment throughout 2025. It remains to be seen just how effective the Gravehawks will be, but they will undoubtedly force both Ukraine and Russia to continue adapting and stretch the limits of their militaries. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you, as always, for watching.